Ever wondered what life was like for the women who watched their husbands, fathers, and brothers ride off to battle, never knowing if they would return? Have you ever thought about the silent struggles happening back home while the men were off seeking glory in far-off lands? What really happened to the homes and hearts left behind in the year 1202, when the Fourth Crusade was underway? Number 10. The agony of lingering uncertainty and absence. Imagine waking up every single day not knowing. Not knowing if the person you loved, the man you shared your life with, was still alive. Not knowing if he was injured, starving, or a prisoner in a distant land. This was the crushing reality for countless women left behind in 1202, as their husbands, sons, and brothers answered the call of the crusade. Communication was not just slow, it was virtually non-existent. There were no letters delivered by speedy postal services, no instant messages, no telegraphs, certainly no telephone. Information traveled at the pace of a horse or a ship, often taking months, even years, to reach its destination, if it ever arrived at all. A woman might hear rumors from a passing merchant or a returning pilgrim, but these whispers were often unreliable, exaggerated, or devastatingly late. A knight might have fallen in battle months ago, or succumbed to disease in a foreign camp, and his wife would continue to live in a limbo of hope and despair. This uncertainty was a constant, gnawing pain. It colored every aspect of their lives, turning everyday tasks into burdens and joyous occasions into bittersweet reminders of absence. For a woman whose husband had joined the crusade, the days stretched into an agonizing eternity. She couldn't grieve properly because there was no certainty of death. She couldn't move on with her life because there was always the faint possibility of his return. Chronicles from the period, though often focusing on the actions of men, sometimes hint at this profound domestic silence. They mention noblewomen who took vows of chastity while their husbands were away, a public declaration of their loyalty and their enduring weight. But behind these formal gestures lay a private torment. What if he came back unrecognizable, changed by years of brutal warfare? What if he never came back at all, and she was left to bear the weight of widowhood without ever receiving confirmation? The lack of closure was a unique form of torture. There was no funeral to attend, no body to bury, no grave to visit. Just an empty space at the table and an unanswered question echoing through the halls of her home. The economic implications of this uncertainty were also profound. If a husband was presumed dead, his lands and assets might be disputed, potentially leaving his widow and children vulnerable. But if he was merely absent, she had to maintain the estate, manage its finances, and fend off any opportunists who might try to claim her rights or land. This required immense fortitude and a constant state of readiness. She couldn't fully commit to long-term plans, like arranging marriages for her children, without knowing if her husband would return to assume his patriarchal role. This forced stagnation, this inability to plan for the future, was an invisible chain binding these women. They lived their lives in a holding pattern, forever waiting for news that might or might not arrive. The burden of this perpetual suspension was often overlooked in historical accounts that celebrate the heroism of the Crusaders, yet it was a fundamental hardship that shaped the lives of countless women in 1202 and beyond. The very air they breathed seemed to carry the weight of unanswered questions, a silent testament to the personal cost of medieval warfare. Number 9. Disease, famine, and resource scarcity. Life in medieval Europe, even without the added disruption of a crusade, was fraught with peril. Disease was a constant companion, often sweeping through communities with terrifying speed and lethality. Famine was a recurring threat, its specter looming over every harvest, ready to descend if crops failed or weather turned harsh. For women left behind during the Crusades in 1202, these universal dangers were amplified, made more terrifying by the absence of male protection and provision. A household without its primary male provider, whether a husband, father, or adult son, was inherently more vulnerable. He was often the one who would secure food supplies, negotiate prices with merchants, or even physically defend the stores from desperate neighbors or roving bands. His absence meant a critical link in the chain of survival was gone, leaving women to face these existential threats largely alone. Consider the annual cycle of agricultural life that underpinned medieval society. The success of the harvest was paramount. It dictated survival. When a knight or a peasant joined the crusade, he left behind fields that still needed tending, livestock that required care, and a household that needed feeding. While women and children were certainly active participants in agricultural labor, the heavier, more physically demanding tasks often fell to men. Without them, fields might not be adequately plowed, sown, or harvested, leading to reduced yields. This directly translated to less food for the family, less grain to sell, and less security against the lean winter months. Even if a woman had servants or tenants, the ultimate responsibility and strategic planning for the estate's productivity fell squarely on her shoulders, often with less experience or authority than her absent husband. Moreover, disease spread easily in medieval communities, particularly in towns and villages where sanitation was poor. When plague or a fever swept through, the absence of a male protector meant a woman might not have someone strong enough to nurse the sick, to fetch water from a distant well, or to find a local healer. Children, already vulnerable, became even more so. The mortality rates for women and children during these outbreaks were already high, and the Crusader's wife faced these risks without the comforting presence or practical aid of her husband. She might find herself solely responsible for burying the dead, comforting the dying, and managing the aftermath of tragedy, all while trying to keep her remaining family healthy and fed. This relentless struggle against the fundamental forces of nature and biology was a constant, draining battle. Resource scarcity extended beyond just food. Medieval households relied on a steady supply of wood for fuel, water for drinking and washing, and access to markets for tools, seeds, and other necessities. Without a man to oversee these vital provisions, a woman might find herself struggling to maintain the household's basic needs. Legal records and chronicles, though sparse on the minutiae of daily life for common women, often reveal instances where women petitioned authorities for relief during times of famine or excessive taxation, highlighting their increased burden. Collective memory of these times was one of hardship, where every scrap of food, every healthy body, and every warm fire was a precious commodity. For the women of 1202, left to fend for themselves in a world already precarious, disease, famine, and the relentless struggle for basic resources were not abstract concepts, but ever-present, terrifying realities. Number 8. Single parenthood and child-rearing challenges. When a man left for the Crusades, he left behind not just a wife, but often a family. Children, ranging from infants to teenagers, suddenly found themselves without a father figure, and their mothers were thrust into the demanding role of sole caregiver and provider. This was not merely about comforting a crying child or teaching them manners. It encompassed the full spectrum of their upbringing, education, protection, and preparation for a harsh medieval world. 1202, societal expectations for children, especially boys, were deeply tied to their father's lineage and profession. A noble son was expected to learn chivalry, estate management, and warfare from his father, or a designated guardian. A peasant boy was to learn farming from his father. When the father was absent, this vital transmission of knowledge and skills was disrupted, placing an immense burden on the mother to either find suitable replacements or to take on roles she was traditionally unequipped for. For a noblewoman, the challenge was particularly acute. She might be responsible for securing tutors for her sons in subjects like Latin and military strategy, and for overseeing their training in arms, which was usually the father's domain. She had to ensure her daughters received the appropriate education in household management, potentially arranging their marriages, a task that often involved complex negotiations with other powerful families. These responsibilities were not just time-consuming. They required political acumen and social connections that her husband would typically handle. Without him, she navigated this intricate world alone, often with limited authority and increased scrutiny. The well-being and future prospects of her children rested entirely on her shoulders, a weight that could be suffocating. Beyond formal education, there was the daily reality of raising children in a world without a consistent male presence. Discipline, emotional support, and simply being there were now her exclusive duties. If the child fell ill, she was the sole one responsible for their care, often without the means to call upon professional medical help. Problems arose, whether a squabble among siblings or a more serious transgression, she was the one to mediate and enforce consequences. The emotional toll of constantly being on call, without a partner to share the load, to offer respite, or to provide a different perspective, was immense. She might have servants or other family members living with her, but the ultimate emotional and moral burden of raising her children fell to her alone. Furthermore, medieval childhood was often short and harsh. Children were expected to contribute to the household economy from a young age. For a mother managing a struggling estate, her children might be called upon to work harder or earlier than they would have otherwise. This meant less time for childhood, less time for play, and more exposure to the difficult realities of survival. If her husband did not return, her sons would inherit his title and responsibilities at a younger age, thrusting them into adulthood prematurely. This meant she not only had to raise them, but prepare them to assume immense duties, often while battling her own grief and the financial pressures of the household. The single mothers of 1202 faced an unparalleled challenge, not just in keeping their children alive, but in raising them to be successful adults in a society that often offered little support to those outside traditional family structure. Their quiet resilience in the face of such overwhelming odds is a testament to their strength. Number 7, the burden of debt and mortgages. Joining a crusade was an extraordinarily expensive undertaking in 1202. Knights, nobles, and even wealthier peasants often had to liquidate assets or incur significant debt to fund their journey. Equipments like armor, weapons, horses, and the cost of travel, provisions, and retinue added up quickly. It was not uncommon for a man to mortgage his lands, properties, or future harvests to secure the necessary funds. When he departed, the burden of these financial arrangements and the very real risk of losing everything fell squarely on the shoulders of the woman left behind. She became the de facto manager of a household, potentially teetering on the brink of financial ruin, facing creditors who were often unforgiving and ruthless. Imagine the anxiety of knowing that the very roof over your head, the land that fed your family, was pledged to a money lender or a wealthier lord. The interest rates in the medieval period could be exorbitant, and the repayment schedules inflexible. Without her husband's traditional role as head of the household and primary negotiator, the Crusader's wife was often left to manage these complex financial obligations alone. She might have little experience in such matters, relying instead on her husband for these decisions. Now she had to navigate a world of legal documents, cunning merchants, and demanding overlords, all while trying to keep her family fed and clothed. Failure to make payments could result in the forfeiture of land, livestock, or even personal possessions, leading to destitution for her and her children. Historical records, such as charters and legal disputes from the period, sometimes highlight these struggles. They show instances of women pleading with courts, negotiating with creditors, or even attempting to sell off portions of their dower lands to cover debts incurred by their absent husbands. The emotional strain of this constant financial pressure cannot be overstated. Every harvest became a make or break moment. Every market transaction, every negotiation over taxes or feudal dues was a high-stakes gamble. She had to be shrewd, resourceful, and incredibly resilient. She couldn't afford to make mistakes. The consequences were too severe. Furthermore, the uncertainty of her husband's return compounded the debt problem. He was presumed dead. Her dower rights, the portion of his estate she was legally entitled to, might be disputed by his male relatives, who could argue that the debts predated her claim. If he eventually returned, he might find his estate decimated, his reputation tarnished, and his family struggling with poverty, all due to the financial obligations he left behind. The crusading ideal might have been about spiritual redemption and military glory, but its practical consequences often involved massive financial upheaval for the families at home. The women who bore this economic weight, silently battling to preserve their homes and livelihoods against the relentless tide of debt, deserve recognition for their unwavering fortitude. They were the unsung financial managers and protectors of their family's future. Number 6, social stigmatization and loss of standing. In the highly structured society of medieval Europe, a woman's identity and social standing were deeply intertwined with that of her husband or the male head of her household. When a man departed for the Crusades in 1202, his wife was often left in a precarious social position, navigating a world that often viewed her with a mixture of pity, suspicion, and even contempt. She was no longer just Lady Eleanor or Dame Isabel. She was the Crusader's wife, a title that carried its own complex connotations. While some might admire her husband's piety and bravery, others might see her as a woman without a protector, making her vulnerable to exploitation or social slights. Her husband's absence created a void that was difficult to fill, both practically and symbolically. For noblewomen, the loss of social standing could manifest in various ways. The network of alliances, political influence, and patronage that her husband maintained was crucial for their family's prestige and security. Without him, those connections might weaken, or rival families might seek to exploit the perceived weakness of a household headed by a woman. She might find herself excluded from important social gatherings, treated with less deference, or even subject to gossip and slander. The medieval period was deeply patriarchal, and while women certainly held influence within their domestic spheres, public authority was largely reserved for men. Stepping into that public sphere, even out of necessity, could be met with resistance or disapproval. She might have to fight to maintain her family's reputation, reminding others of her husband's status and the legitimacy of her authority, often in the face of thinly veiled disrespect. For women of lower social standing, the challenges were different but equally profound. A peasant woman whose husband was away might be ostracized by her neighbors, or her children might be bullied without a strong male presence to defend them. She might find it harder to secure favorable terms for labor or goods, as her economic power was diminished. Some women were even accused of promiscuity or witchcraft in the absence of their husbands, as medieval society was quick to judge those who deviated from traditional norms. A crusader's wife often found herself under intense scrutiny, her actions and choices magnified and judged by the community. Furthermore, the ideal of the perfect crusader was often accompanied by the expectation that his wife would be a paragon of virtue, patiently waiting, praying, and managing the household impeccably. This idealized image placed an enormous psychological burden on these women. They were expected to be strong and resilient, yet also submissive and loyal. Any deviation from this narrow path could lead to social condemnation. If a woman had to take on traditionally male roles, like managing legal affairs or engaging in trade, she might be seen as stepping outside her proper place, even if it was born of necessity. This silent judgment, this loss of respect, and the subtle ways society could diminish her standing, added another layer of hardship to an already challenging existence. She was not only bearing the weight of her household, but also the collective expectations and sometimes the disdain of her community. Number 5, physical insecurity and risk of violence. The absence of a male protector in medieval society, particularly for a woman left behind by a crusader in 1202, significantly amplified her vulnerability to physical insecurity and violence. While medieval life was generally dangerous for everyone, women without a husband, father, or adult male guardian were often seen as easier targets for opportunistic individuals, whether they were common criminals, disgruntled neighbors, or even rogue soldiers. Family home, which should have been a sanctuary, could become a place of anxiety. The roads and fields, once traversed with some degree of male escort, became fraught with peril. Consider the basic protection a man provided: a strong arm to deter thieves, a presence that commanded respect and discouraged unwanted advances, or simply the ability to defend the household against intruders. When this protection vanished, women and their children were exposed. Banditry was a persistent problem in medieval Europe, and a household headed by a woman might be perceived as an easy target for raids, particularly if it was known that the husband was away on a long and uncertain journey. Livestock, harvested crops, and even personal possessions could be stolen with little recourse, leaving the family destitute. The risk extended beyond simple theft to physical assault, a chilling reality that many women fear. Moreover, the prolonged absence of a lord could lead to instability within the feudal hierarchy itself. Vassals might challenge the authority of a lady left in charge, or powerful neighbors might attempt to encroach on her lands, knowing that her husband was not there to defend his rights. While a noblewoman might have loyal retainers, their effectiveness and loyalty could be tested without the ultimate authority of the lord himself. She might find herself embroiled in legal disputes over property or boundaries, where her legal standing was weaker, and she lacked the physical power to enforce her claims. This put immense pressure on women to be constantly vigilant, to cultivate alliances, and to be prepared to defend their interests, even if it meant risking direct confrontation. For women of lower social standing, the risks were even more immediate. A peasant woman working her fields alone or traveling to market was vulnerable to harassment or attack. Her home, often lacking strong defenses, was susceptible to intrusion. The very mobility of women, even within their own communities, could be curtailed by the fear of violence. She might have to rely more heavily on male relatives, if any were available, or retreat further into her domestic sphere, limiting her ability to manage the household's external affairs. The threat of violence, both from outside and within the community, was a constant, unspoken fear that shaped the daily lives of women whose protectors were absent. They were forced to live with an increased sense of vulnerability, adapting their routines and taking precautions that would have been unnecessary had their men remained at home. This pervasive sense of insecurity was a heavy burden, often overlooked in the grand narratives of crusading heroism. Number 4, profound emotional and psychological burden. Beneath the practical hardships of managing an estate, raising children alone, and fending off creditors, lay an even deeper, more pervasive struggle for women left behind during the Crusades in 1202, a profound emotional and psychological burden. This was a constant, gnawing anxiety, a persistent loneliness, and a pervasive sense of grief for a loss that might not even be confirmed. Imagine the weight of constant worry about your husband's safety in a distant, dangerous land. Every unexpected knock at the door, every rumor brought by a passing traveler, would send a jolt of fear through her heart. Was this the news she dreaded? Was it confirmation of his death, or perhaps even worse, news of his capture and torture? This mental torment was relentless, leaving little room for peace or joy. The loneliness was a palpable presence. Medieval society, particularly for noblewomen, often restricted independent social interaction. Her social life revolved around her husband and his connections. With him gone, her world could shrink dramatically. While she might have female relatives or servants, the absence of her partner, the confidant and companion, created an emotional void that could not be filled by others. She might spend long hours in quiet contemplation, rereading old letters, or looking at a small keepsake, clinging to memories while battling the creeping despair of uncertainty. This isolation was not merely physical, it was deeply emotional, cutting her off from the intimate connection that sustained her. Grief was another complex emotion she had to navigate. Even if her husband was still alive, his absence was a form of loss. She was living a half-life, a shadow of her former self. As was often the case, news of his death eventually arrived, or if he simply never returned and was presumed lost, the grief would be agonizing. Yet, even in death, her sorrow could be complicated by the circumstances. There was no closure, no body to mourn over, no communal funeral rites. Her grief was private, often endured in silence, while she simultaneously had to maintain a facade of strength and capability for her children and household. This forced stoicism, this suppression of natural human emotion, could lead to deep psychological scars. Beyond personal grief, there was the collective anxiety for the future. Her identity, her security, and her children's prospects were all tied to her husband's fate. If he did not return, what would become of her? Would she be forced into another marriage? Would her children lose their inheritance? These existential questions added to the immense psychological weight. Chronicles and historical poems occasionally feature women who withered away from prolonged sorrow, or who took refuge in convents, unable to bear the weight of their uncertain widowhood. While these may be romanticized, they reflect a deeper truth about the profound emotional cost of the Crusades for the women left behind. They were not just managing estates, they were battling their own hearts and minds, enduring a silent war of anxiety, loneliness, and enduring sorrow. Number 3, legal disempowerment and vulnerability to exploitation. In 1202, medieval legal systems were overwhelmingly patriarchal. A woman's legal standing was often tied to her relationship with a male guardian, her father, her husband, or if widowed, her adult son or another male relative. When a man left for the Crusades, his wife, despite potentially being left in charge of his estates, often found herself in a legally precarious position, highly vulnerable to exploitation by ambitious neighbors, unscrupulous relatives, or grasping authorities. This was a hardship that threatened not just her immediate livelihood, but the very inheritance and future of her children. Consider the concept of coverture, a common legal principle where a married woman's legal identity was subsumed by that of her husband. She could not typically own property independently, enter into contracts, or initiate legal proceedings without his consent or presence. When he was gone, these limitations became glaring obstacles. While some legal customs granted women more autonomy, especially if they were regents for minor sons, their authority was often temporary and could be challenged. Rivals might exploit this by disputing land boundaries, challenging property deeds, or claiming debts that were not legitimately owed. A woman trying to defend her family's interests in court would face a system designed by and for men, where her voice carried less weight and her arguments might be easily dismissed. The very absence of her husband made her a target. His male relatives, eager to secure control of the family's wealth or titles, might attempt to undermine her authority, or even try to force her into a marriage that served their interests rather than her own or her children's. There are historical accounts of noblewomen who had to fiercely defend their dower lands, the portion of their husband's estate set aside for their maintenance, against the claims of his male kin. They might face legal battles that dragged on for years, draining their resources and mental energy. Without her husband's legal presence and network of powerful connections, she was at a significant disadvantage, often forced to rely on the goodwill of others or the rare intervention of a benevolent lord. Furthermore, women could be coerced or intimidated into signing away rights or property. Lacking legal counsel or a male protector to advise them, they might fall prey to fraudulent schemes or unfair agreements. Even if she was intelligent and capable, the societal and legal structures were stacked against her. Her very gender made her suspect in the eyes of the law, often deemed less rational or less capable of managing complex affairs. This constant struggle against legal disempowerment and the very real threat of losing everything due to predatory practices added immense stress to the lives of Crusader wives. They had to be not just managers and mothers, but also shrewd legal strategists, battling a system that inherently marginalized them, all while waiting for a husband who might never return to reclaim his rightful place. Number 2, overwhelming domestic and estate management. In 1202, the social and economic backbone of Europe was land. For a noble or knightly family, the estate was not merely a home, it was a complex agricultural and administrative enterprise. When the lord left for the Crusades, his wife was often left with the daunting, overwhelming responsibility of managing this entire operation. This was far more than keeping a tidy house. It meant overseeing vast tracts of land, hundreds of serfs or tenants, livestock, finances, justice, and community relations. Many women had received some training in household management, but stepping into the full authority and practical duties of the lord was a leap into an entirely new and challenging world. Imagine being suddenly responsible for the annual agricultural cycle, ensuring fields were plowed, seeds sown, and harvests gathered. This involved directing male laborers, often a challenging task for a woman in a hierarchical society. She had to understand crop rotation, soil quality, and the vagaries of the weather. Beyond the fields, there were forests to manage, mills to operate, and potentially mines or other local industries to oversee. Financial accounts, once handled by her husband or a steward under his direct supervision, were now her primary concern. This meant collecting rents and taxes from tenants, managing expenditures, paying wages, and keeping meticulous records, often without a detailed understanding of the complex feudal economy. Any misstep could lead to financial ruin for the family. The role extended to administering justice within the estate. The lord was often the ultimate arbiter of disputes among his tenants, presiding over local courts and enforcing customary law. The lady, though not always legally empowered to hold court herself, might be expected to step into this role or at least supervise her bailiffs. She would have to mediate conflicts, punish transgressions, and maintain order, often relying on her innate authority and wisdom in a system that preferred male leadership. This required not only an understanding of local customs, but also a strong will and the ability to command respect. Beyond the estate, she was responsible for external relations. This included negotiating with neighboring lords, maintaining alliances, and representing her family's interests in the wider political landscape. If her husband owed feudal service to a higher lord, she might have to arrange for substitute knights or pay a scutage tax, a financial burden that could be significant. Her social responsibilities also expanded. She was expected to uphold the family's honor, entertain visiting dignitaries, and ensure the continuation of the family line, especially if her children were young. The sheer volume and diversity of these responsibilities were immense. Many women, while educated in certain domestic arts, were unprepared for the detailed complexities of estate management, military oversight, or legal administration. They had to learn on the job, often through trial and error, all while battling the emotional turmoil of their husband's absence and the constant threat of external pressures. Their ability to successfully navigate these overwhelming duties was a testament to their intelligence, adaptability, and unwavering commitment to preserving their family's legacy in a world that often underestimated their capabilities. Number 1. Financial collapse and economic struggle. The most immediate and pervasive hardship for women left behind during the Crusades in 1202 was the almost inevitable descent into financial collapse and ceaseless economic struggle. The medieval economy was built on the land and the labor of men. When the primary income earner, the husband, father, or adult son, departed for a holy war, the household's economic foundation fractured, often leading to a cascade of desperate circumstances that profoundly affected every aspect of a woman's life. For noble and knightly families, the journey to the Holy Land was astronomically expensive. A knight often had to sell or mortgage a significant portion of his land, possessions, or future income to fund his participation. This meant that even before he left, his wife was already facing a household with diminished assets and looming debts. His departure immediately cut off the primary source of income and management. While women were often skilled in managing the daily household, the strategic oversight of a large estate, its agricultural production, its rents, its feudal obligations typically fell to the lord. Without him, the flow of income could slow to a trickle or halt entirely. Taxes still had to be paid to the overlord, feudal dues still needed to be rendered, and the costs of maintaining the household, feeding the family, and paying servants did not diminish. This created an immediate, crushing financial deficit. A woman, even if she had some experience in household management, suddenly found herself solely responsible for an entire economic unit. She had to oversee the tenants, ensure the fields were productive, and collect the often irregular payments. If crops failed, or if tenants struggled, she bore the burden of finding solutions, often without the authority or resources her husband would have commanded. She might struggle to sell goods in the market, lacking the connections or the negotiating power of a man. Every decision became a high-stakes gamble with the family's survival. Should she sell off more land? Should she borrow at exorbitant rates? Should she cut back on food for her children or dismiss loyal servants? These agonizing choices were her daily reality. For peasant women, the situation was even more dire. Her husband was a farmer. His labor was directly tied to the family's survival. Without him, the fields might lie fallow, or the harvest might be insufficient. She and her children would have to shoulder the burden of the physical labor, often leading to exhaustion and a struggle to keep themselves fed. The feudal lord still demanded his share of the produce, leaving even less for the family's consumption. Many peasant women would have been forced to take on additional, often arduous, labor for meager wages, just to keep their families from starving. They might resort to begging, gleaning leftover crops from harvested fields, or engaging in small-scale bartering, anything to stave off destitution. The long-term effects of this financial strain were devastating. Many families lost their lands and status, falling into poverty from which they could never recover. Daughters might be unable to secure suitable marriages due to their families' reduced circumstances, and sons might lose their inheritance. Crusader's wife, often the sole bulwark against this tide of economic disaster, fought a silent, relentless battle against penury. Unwavering struggle to maintain her family's solvency in the face of insurmountable odds remains one of the most poignant and underappreciated hardships of medieval women in the Crusades.